So the UFC is kind of bad now. And I know coming off of UFC 316, Marab versus O'Malley, this might seem like a weird message because it was a great card with great fights, but that's sort of my bigger point. I don't think anyone cares. I say that as someone who the UFC changed the course of my whole life. I started training jiu-jitsu because I loved watching the UFC. I worked my way into being a professional MMA fighter because my goal was to make it to the UFC, and I didn't. Who's bitter? Not me, but as someone who's been watching the UFC since Rampage Jackson knocked out Chuck Liddell, I can confidently say this is the worst the UFC has ever been. Let's look at some of the problems right now, and I will give you the easy fix at the end of this video. Problem number one is that prize fighting run by a for-profit publicly traded company is a model that just does not work. Capitalism and fighting can go hand in hand, but the problem becomes when ultra capitalists try to minimize as much cost as possible but extract maximum profits. The things they end up cutting are the things that make the UFC great and what made them great for 20 years before the Endeavor deal. When you're trying to maximize profits, you're gonna get low quality cards, you're gonna get low fighter purses, you're gonna get a ton of Apex cards, which I think we all pretty much agree suck. And the result is you're going to get a lack of stars because building stars is not the model anymore, and the product gets watered down, and we're going to talk more about that watering down in just a minute. But do you remember the Jose Aldo versus Conor McGregor World Tour press conference and the greatest commercial ever made by the UFC? Could you imagine them doing with any fighter on the roster right now? Any sort of marketing like that? No, of course not. They don't do that anymore. It's very difficult to build up stars when there's literally a card every single weekend, and there's thousands of prospects that we as the fans need to keep track of, and the UFC is trying to put out as many cards as possible. The UFC needs bodies, and they're not trying to build stars. Building stars is not their model anymore, and I think that's a major problem. Speaking of the downside of capitalism, I think the ESPN deal was the worst thing that ever happened to the UFC. In that deal, the UFC is required to put on a certain number of events every year. So if you're the UFC, you're not going to worry about selling out arenas and putting on massive stacked cards. You're going to do as many small shows as possible with a bunch of fighters that no one has ever heard of because you're just trying to fill a quota. You're worried about quantity over quality. There's a reason there's a card on every week, and every week you don't know who any of the fighters are. It's not in the UFC's best interest to put on big shows. I don't think it's the fights themselves that are bad, and when you look at the stats, the finish rate is about the same as it was in the last decade. It's the total number of fights that's the problem. In the 2010s, there was an average of 421 individual fights each year, and that number does skew higher towards the end of the decade when the model was shifting to more quantity over quality, but still 421. Last year, 2024, the UFC put on 548 individual fights. That's a 30% increase over the average from the previous decade, and this year, 2025, they're on track to do more fights than they did in 2024. It's just a complete oversaturation. When you add in the fact that the pay-per-views for the UFC are behind a double paywall, meaning you have to pay monthly for ESPN Plus to then be allowed the opportunity to again pay for the pay-per-view, you're going to dissuade people from watching your bigger events. And if you think you can just go and watch in person, well, you're going to shell out over $300 for nosebleed seats. Also, this is just a personal complaint. Can we move the cards earlier? Because 10 o'clock on the East Coast is just too late to stay up till 2 in the morning for a main event that, no one really asked for. But can we just move it earlier? Like 8 o'clock start on the East Coast? That would be great. A large share of the blame for this decline rests squarely on the shoulders of Dana White. There's a lot of things that are happening. You look at right now, as of right now, this recording, the John Jones situation is playing out where he's just not being stripped for some reason and he's completely log jamming the division, and I would argue wasting Tom Aspinall's prime, but he's just letting John Jones be John Jones.
I guarantee you this fight's going to happen. This fight's going to happen. Fight's going to happen.
Power slap cannot be ignored when you've got Dana White, the face of the UFC, commingling the brands with the dumb as fuck, let's slap the shit out of each other. I guess sport, he wants us to call it a sport, but then you've got the UFC social media spamming power slap and they're promoting it during UFC events. It just taints the UFC brand and makes us all look really stupid. Dana White used to be, still is, maybe the driving force behind the UFC and the decisions that the company makes, but in 2025, he's missed like 70% of the press conferences. Could you imagine in the 2010s, Dana White not showing up to 70% of the press conferences? I understand you could be commenting right now that I'm just nostalgic for the 2010s with Dana White and the way he operated, but it's not nostalgia. It's if they want to continue the same model and have Dana White be the face of the company, he has to be the face of the company or move on. And this one isn't super on just Dana White, it's on the company as a whole, but the talent management right now is atrocious. Like, look at a guy like Movsar Evloev, a guy who realistically could be fighting for potentially a champion within a year, and do you know who he is? Do you think a casual fan knows who he is? This guy is super talented. He's the reason I'm saying he could be a future champion. His last fight was on a prelim of a pay-per-view that, let's be honest, people didn't really want to watch. The Pantoja fight. No one was really clamoring for that, and that was only the main event after Bilal versus Shakvat got canceled in December. Again, you're putting this guy who could be a champion on, in the best case scenario, a card that is headlined by Bilal, a guy that people don't already like. This dude should be on the main card at the biggest events. Promote this guy, because when you don't, you end up with a guy who could be champion that the casual fan has no idea who they are. Market the fighters, recognize what you have. They don't seem to be doing that. They don't seem to know what they have in this guy. And I think that speaks to a bigger problem, that the talent management is just not what it used to be. And it feels like if you want to be a fan of the UFC, you need to seek them out and you need to seek information out rather than them bringing it to you. And this is going to get anecdotal. I understand that, but just bear with me for a second. Do you see commercials for the UFC anymore on anything else besides ESPN Plus? Like, if you're watching something that isn't on ESPN Plus, are they showing commercials for the UFC? Do you see UFC commercials like you used to? Because I personally don't. Let me know in the comments if I'm way off base and you see commercials all the time, but I don't. I remember going to bars or restaurants or whatever, and they would have posters up of the events that are coming up and pay-per-views that are happening soon. I don't see that anymore. The UFC marketing has changed. I feel like if they were competing for eyeballs, they would be doing more. They wouldn't just be relying on it's fight week and, oh, isn't it hilarious how Nina Drama doesn't know how to fight and these professional fighters are like teaching her? Isn't that so funny? Aren't these stupid interviews that she's doing, aren't they hilarious? They're not. I don't know if anyone is really clamoring for this content, but how is this the marketing that's happening for the pay-per-view that's coming up? The same Nina Drama stupid videos they made for the last pay-per-view that I guess we're supposed to forget she made because this one's so funny. It's new. I don't know. I don't get it. I don't get it. I told you I would give you a solution to the problems. Here it is. Number one, Dana White either needs to fully buy back in or step aside. Really dive back into being the head of the company and the face of the company and putting as much effort in as possible. Stop trying to do boxing that you then get fired from. Stop with Power Slap. Buy into the UFC or move on. I don't know who should replace him. I'll do it. You can hire me. Buy in or get out of the way. Also, the ESPN deal, I know they're renegotiating right now, and I think re-signing with ESPN is looking like the most likely thing. Don't do that. You're not gonna take my advice, but change the deal that it's not quantity over quality. Don't have a card every single weekend filled with people no one's ever heard of. Pull back a little bit. I think fight nights are still great. I think they're an important feeder and an important way you can build up prospects, but you have to use the fight night cards to build up prospects, not just to put bodies out there to meet a quota. And lastly, I'd say you need to market these fighters better than you're doing right now. You need to push these guys. You need to make these guys into stars. Ilya Topuria should be a star. Tom Aspinall. There's a whole roster of people with personality and talent to be stars. Push them. Make them into stars. Do what you're supposed to do. Promote the fights. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is the UFC as bad right now as I think it is? What would you change to make it better? Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.